Case number 1 is that of James Douglas Drayton, a man whose rampage in 2022 would leave 5 people dead and a South Carolina community forever scarred. What makes his crime particularly haunting is not just the scale of the violence, but the setting. The killings took place in a house known as a refuge, a safe haven for people struggling with addiction, a place meant for recovery and healing. Instead, it became the scene of a massacre that exposed how quickly desperation and rage can turn deadly. Drayton, a 24-year-old man from Spartanburg County, was no stranger to hardship. He had battled addiction himself and had found temporary shelter in the very home where his victims lived, a place meant to offer second chances. For a while, it seemed to work. Residents described him as quiet, distant, and trying to stay sober. But beneath the surface, his behavior grew erratic, his paranoia increasing by the day. Those around him noticed the shift, but never imagined what would come next. On one August night, that fragile sense of peace shattered. Armed and volatile, Drayton opened fire on the people who had once tried to help him. Within minutes, 5 men were dead. Their lives ended in the very space they had sought comfort and recovery. The victims were not strangers or random targets. They were fellow residents, men united by a shared struggle to rebuild their lives. The crime scene that deputies would later enter was described as one of the most horrific in the county's recent memory. There were no warning calls, no time for anyone to escape. When law enforcement arrived, the house that once symbolized hope had become a house of death. Drayton was gone, having fled in one of the victims' vehicles. His escape set off a multi-state manhunt that ended less than 24 hours later in Georgia. Authorities located him after he attempted to rob a convenience store, another desperate act by a man spiraling beyond reason. When arrested, Drayton reportedly confessed to the killings without resistance. He told investigators that he had been under the influence of methamphetamine and believed the men in the home were plotting against him. Whether it was paranoia or delusion, his explanation offered little comfort to the families left behind. As the investigation unfolded, the broader tragedy became clear. The home where the murders occurred was part of a local effort to help those recovering from addiction, a symbol of community compassion. That mission was instantly undone by one man's relapse into violence. 5 lives were gone, and a network of volunteers and survivors was left reeling, questioning how a place built for healing could become the site of such carnage. In court, prosecutors described the killings as execution style, methodical, and senseless. The charges against Drayton included 5 counts of murder, 1 for each man whose life he took, and additional charges for armed robbery and possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. His calm demeanor during the proceedings unsettled even seasoned officers. The weight of what he had done seemed to register in fragments, brief moments of remorse overshadowed by detachment. For Spartanburg County, the name James Douglas Drayton became synonymous with devastation. The safe house, once a cornerstone of compassion, was later shut down. Survivors of addiction programs across the state spoke about the lasting fear it created, the reminder that recovery is fragile, and that some who need saving can become the source of others' pain. Drayton's case stands as one of South Carolina's darkest modern crimes, a convergence of addiction, mental unraveling, and sudden, unrestrained violence. He will spend the rest of his life facing the consequences of a night that destroyed not just 5 families, but an entire community's sense of safety. And while his rampage left the state in shock, the next case moves from senseless bloodshed to calculated intent, a killing that led to decades of debate and execution and questions that still linger about race, justice, and the finality of death. Case number 2 is that of Richard Bernard Moore, a man whose crime, conviction, and eventual execution in 2024 reignited one of the most polarizing debates in South Carolina's history. His story began with a robbery that spiraled into murder and ended with a legal battle that would last more than 2 decades. What made Moore's case so controversial wasn't only the brutality of his crime, but the lingering questions about race, punishment, and the power of choice in the face of death. On the evening of September 16, 1999, Richard Moore entered Nikki's Speedy Mart, a small convenience store in Spartanburg, South Carolina. He was unarmed but desperate, addicted to crack cocaine, and looking for money to support his habit. What happened inside that store unfolded in seconds, but would haunt the state for decades. Moore got into a struggle with the clerk, 42-year-old James Mahoney, a hard-working family man who was simply doing his job. During the altercation, Mahoney pulled a handgun, and a fight ensued. When the smoke cleared, Mahoney was dead, shot in the chest with his own weapon. Moore fled the scene but was arrested soon after. Prosecutors argued that the robbery had turned into a cold-blooded killing, one that warranted the death penalty. The defense countered that Moore never entered the store intending to kill anyone, that the shooting was the chaotic result of a struggle gone wrong. But the jury saw it differently. In 2001, Moore was sentenced to die, becoming one of the few inmates on South Carolina's death row whose case would persist into the next century of legal reform and moral scrutiny. Over the years, Moore's case became symbolic. To some, he was the embodiment of justice served, a man whose choices led to a tragic but inevitable end. To others, he was proof of a system tainted by inequality. Moore, a black man, had killed a white victim in a southern state still grappling with racial and socioeconomic disparities. His legal team argued that bias, both overt and implicit, had shaped the outcome of his trial and the severity of his punishment. Those claims would follow his case through countless appeals, all the way to the state Supreme Court and beyond. As the decades passed, South Carolina's death penalty process grew increasingly complicated. Legal challenges over lethal injection protocols halted executions for years. When the state reinstated its right to carry out death sentences, it gave inmates a choice: death by firing squad or lethal injection. In a decision that drew national attention, Richard Moore chose the needle over the gun. He explained that while both options were barbaric, lethal injection felt less dehumanizing. It was a grim choice, but one that reflected the state's ongoing struggle to reconcile punishment with ethics. On November 8, 2024, after nearly 25 years of legal battles, Richard Bernard Moore was executed by lethal injection at the Broad River Correctional Institution. Reporters described him as calm and composed in his final moments. His last words expressed remorse for Mahoney's death, but also defiance toward the system that condemned him. Outside the prison, protesters gathered on both sides, some demanding justice for the victim, others calling his death a failure of moral progress. James Mahoney's family, who had waited decades for closure, finally received it, though the pain never truly subsided. For them, justice was not about revenge, but resolution. For Moore's supporters, his death was one more example of how the system's flaws persist, of how poverty, addiction, and race can dictate who lives and who dies. The case of Richard Bernard Moore stands as a stark reminder of South Carolina's complicated relationship with capital punishment. It is a story about consequences, but also about conscience, how the pursuit of justice can blur the line between punishment and vengeance. And as we leave the execution chamber behind, the next case draws us into a more intimate kind of conflict, a neighborhood dispute turned deadly, where anger over something as trivial as stolen Wi-Fi ended with a single irreversible gunshot. Case number 3 is that of Sharmakika Wright, a South Carolina mother whose life took a violent turn over something so petty and avoidable that it stunned an entire neighborhood. Her story isn't about drugs, gangs, or long-standing rivalries. It's about a moment of anger that escalated beyond reason, proving that sometimes the most senseless acts of violence are born not from hatred, but from pride and impulse. In the spring of 2024, Sharmakika Wright lived in a quiet residential community in Florence County. Neighbors described her as outspoken, but generally cordial, a woman who kept to herself, raising her family and trying to manage the daily frustrations of life. But behind the small talk and neighborly smiles, tension had been brewing. The trouble began over something as absurd as stolen Wi-Fi access. Wright had accused her 22-year-old neighbor, James R. Outland, of using her internet without permission. What started as mild irritation slowly grew into open hostility. There were arguments, exchanged words, and moments when both sides could have walked away. Instead, anger and pride took over. On a humid evening in June 2024, the dispute finally reached its breaking point. According to witnesses, Wright confronted Outland outside their homes. The two argued loudly enough for nearby residents to hear. Outland reportedly tried to de-escalate and step away, but Wright, still fuming, refused to let it end. In a moment of rage, she pulled a gun and fired. The single bullet struck Outland, ending his life before paramedics could arrive. The entire confrontation, from shouting to the fatal shot, lasted less than a minute. Police officers arrived within minutes, responding to multiple 911 calls from horrified neighbors. They found Outland lying motionless in the yard and Wright still on the scene, visibly shaken but defiant. She was arrested without incident, and the weapon, a small handgun she legally owned, was recovered nearby. At the time of her arrest, Wright reportedly told investigators she hadn't meant to kill him, only to scare him. But the damage was irreversible. A man was dead, and a community that had once been defined by calm suburban life now carried the shadow of violence. As the case unfolded, the public struggled to make sense of it. Reporters described it as a modern tragedy of pride, a senseless death sparked by something that could have been solved with a conversation or a phone call. Wright was charged with murder and held at the Florence County Detention Center as prosecutors prepared to take the case to trial. During preliminary hearings, the prosecution emphasized that the shooting wasn't an accident, that Wright had deliberately escalated a verbal argument into a fatal encounter. They argued that her anger had blinded her judgment and turned a trivial dispute into an act of irreversible destruction. Her defense team painted a different picture. They described a woman under stress, living with financial struggles and emotional exhaustion, who reacted in the heat of the moment. They suggested that fear, not malice, drove her to pull the trigger. Fear that the argument might turn violent, that she might be threatened or disrespected once again. But even with those claims, the evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses' accounts were consistent, and the video footage from a nearby doorbell camera captured the confrontation from start to finish. The death of James Outland rippled through the community. Friends and family mourned a young man described as kind, hard-working, and passionate about his future. His death left a deep scar, one that reminded everyone how quickly normalcy can turn into chaos. Neighborhood residents began attending town meetings, calling for more mental health and anger management resources, believing that perhaps Wright's explosion of rage could have been prevented with help and intervention long before that night. For Sharmikitsa Wright, the days that followed were filled with regret and disbelief. In court, she appeared subdued, no longer the fiery neighbor known for her temper. Her expression during hearings was blank, as if she were still processing the reality of what she'd done. The weight of her decision, one moment, one bullet, would follow her for the rest of her life. Her case stands as a sobering reminder of how anger, when unchecked, can destroy multiple lives in seconds. It's a story about the human cost of impulsive decisions and how something as meaningless as stolen Wi-Fi can become the spark that ignites tragedy. And as we move from a neighborhood feud that ended in death, the next case reveals a different kind of fury, one rooted not in words or pride, but in vengeance, where a man's anger toward a postal worker would lead to one of the most shocking murders in South Carolina's rural history. Case number 4 is that of Trevor Rakin Seward, a man whose fury over a missed package spiraled into one of the most senseless murders in South Carolina's history. His victim was not an enemy, not a rival, but a public servant simply doing her job. This case stunned the nation for its sheer absurdity, a fatal act of rage triggered by something as trivial as a postal delivery dispute. It was August 2019 in Williamsburg County, a small rural community where everyone knew their mail carrier by name. For years, 64-year-old U.S. Postal Service worker Irene Presley had been a familiar face on the route. She was dedicated, punctual, and known for her kindness. But on one humid afternoon, that routine day turned deadly when she crossed paths with Trevor Seward, a man consumed by anger over a package she had refused to deliver. The package, according to investigators, contained marijuana. Presley, following federal postal regulations, declined to deliver it. For Seward, that decision wasn't just inconvenient, it was an insult. He took it personally, convinced she was deliberately interfering with his life. Over the next few days, his frustration grew into rage. Neighbors later said they saw Seward pacing outside his home, muttering about getting even. Few took his words seriously, never imagining what he was about to do. On August 23rd, as Presley drove along her usual mail route in her marked postal van, Seward intercepted her. Witnesses reported hearing gunshots echo through the quiet countryside. Presley was struck multiple times, her vehicle swerving off the dirt road before crashing into a ditch. When authorities arrived, she was pronounced dead at the scene, her mail scattered across the grass, a symbol of duty interrupted by senseless violence. Seward fled the area, sparking a manhunt that lasted less than 24 hours. Law enforcement tracked him down through local surveillance footage and cell phone data, arresting him without resistance. In custody, he confessed to the shooting but offered little remorse. He reportedly told investigators that Presley should have minded her business, a statement that chilled everyone who heard it. The trial that followed painted a grim portrait of Seward's mind, a man whose obsession with control and resentment over minor grievances had festered into something deadly. Prosecutors portrayed him as vindictive, a man who viewed Presley's professionalism as a personal attack. The defense tried to argue diminished capacity, suggesting drug use and mental instability, but the jury was unmoved. The evidence, the confession, the ballistics, the eyewitness accounts, left no room for doubt. In 2021, Trevor Rakin Seward was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Presley family, the sentence brought justice but little comfort. Irene had been a mother, grandmother, and beloved figure in her community. She died doing the job she loved, delivering mail to the very people she served every day. Her colleagues at the Postal Service wore black ribbons in her honor, mourning a woman killed for her integrity. The case resonated far beyond South Carolina. It became a symbol of how anger, left unchecked, can mutate into violence, and how no one, not even those who serve the public, is immune to the consequences of another's rage. The tragedy also spurred discussions about safety for postal workers nationwide, with federal officials citing it as one of the most shocking attacks on a mail carrier in recent history. Trevor Seward's name will forever be tied to that senseless act, a reminder that sometimes evil doesn't come from elaborate plans or deep motives. It comes from moments of fury, born out of selfishness and entitlement. And as this story of rage and retaliation closes, the next case takes us into an even darker scene, one of chaos, youth, and violence on a scale so reckless that it left an entire community mourning after what should have been a night of celebration. Case number 5 is that of Tiel Raquel Demon Hollings, a 17-year-old whose name became synonymous with the horror that struck a South Carolina community during what was meant to be a night of unity and celebration. In June 2025, Hollings was one of 3 teenagers charged in a mass shooting at a Juneteenth festival in Sumter County. What began as a community event filled with laughter, food, and music ended in chaos and bloodshed when gunfire erupted into the crowd. Authorities said it happened in seconds. Dozens of people were enjoying the festivities when Hollings and 2 others pulled out weapons and opened fire. Witnesses described a sudden deafening burst of gunshots, followed by screams and confusion. By the time the gunfire stopped, 35-year-old Laparia Cobb was dead and 9 others were wounded. Families hid behind cars and food trucks as officers and medics rushed in to help. What should have been a moment of cultural pride had turned into a scene of terror. Investigators later revealed the shooting stemmed from a dispute earlier in the evening, a petty argument between rival groups that escalated into a deadly show of ego and retaliation. Hollings and the others reportedly returned to the celebration armed, ready to make a statement through violence. Surveillance footage, shell casings, and witness testimony quickly linked them to the attack. Hollings was arrested days later and charged with murder, 9 counts of attempted murder, and possession of a weapon during a violent crime. The case shocked the state, not only because of the brutality, but because of the ages of those involved. These weren't hardened criminals. They were teenagers, still in high school, whose choices had left one woman dead and a community forever changed. In court, prosecutors described the shooting as an act of reckless indifference, fueled by immaturity and the glorification of violence. Hollings showed little emotion during early hearings, standing quietly as the charges were read. The community mourned Cobb's death and demanded accountability, questioning how easily young people could access firearms and why a night meant for peace turned into one of tragedy. The Juneteenth shooting became a symbol of everything wrong with youth violence in South Carolina, a stark reminder that a generation raised amid anger and access to weapons can devastate families in seconds. Hollings now faces the possibility of spending most of his life behind bars, his future traded for a moment of impulsive rage. And as the echoes of that night still linger in Sumter, the next case moves from public chaos to private tragedy, a story of love, betrayal, and the fatal argument that ended one marriage forever. Case number 6 is that of Sheila Denise LeBron, a woman whose name became known across South Carolina for a crime that unfolded not out of hatred, but out of heartbreak and anger. Her story is one of domestic conflict turned deadly, a moment of rage that ended the life of her estranged husband and shattered 2 families forever. In 2020, Sheila LeBron and Jasper Bernard Bryan were in the final stages of separating after years of a troubled marriage. Their relationship had been marked by tension, financial struggles, arguments, and emotional distance that had eroded whatever love once existed between them. When Jasper returned to their home one afternoon to collect his belongings, what should have been a brief, civil exchange turned into a fatal confrontation. According to investigators, an argument broke out almost immediately. Neighbors later reported hearing raised voices and the sound of things breaking inside the house. Jasper reportedly told LeBron he was leaving for good, and something about those words pushed her past the breaking point. In a moment of fury, she grabbed a handgun and fired. The bullet struck Jasper, killing him before help could arrive. LeBron stayed on the scene, distraught and crying when officers arrived. She told them she hadn't planned to shoot him, that she just wanted him to stop talking. But her words couldn't undo what had happened. She was arrested and charged with murder, her life spiraling into the same chaos that had consumed her marriage. In court, prosecutors described the shooting as the tragic result of unresolved anger. They argued that LeBron had acted out of vengeance, not fear. Her defense team countered that the situation had been volatile for years, that she had felt cornered, emotionally manipulated, and desperate. They portrayed her not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a woman who snapped after years of emotional strain. Ultimately, the court accepted her plea to voluntary manslaughter in 2023. She was sentenced to several years in prison, a punishment reflecting both accountability and compassion for the emotional turmoil that led to the crime. The case of Sheila LeBron struck a chord across South Carolina, reminding the public that not all murders are premeditated acts of cruelty. Sometimes they are explosions of emotion, born from years of resentment and silence. Domestic violence advocates pointed to her story as a painful example of how unresolved conflict can escalate when communication and support break down. Jasper Bryan's family mourned his loss, remembering him as a devoted father and friend. For them, forgiveness came slowly. For LeBron, every day behind bars became a reminder of how one impulsive decision destroyed everything she once loved. Her case is a cautionary tale, not just about crime, but about control, emotion, and the fine line between anger and tragedy. It shows how quickly passion can transform into violence when fear and frustration replace understanding. And as this story of domestic heartbreak closes, the next case moves into darker territory, a tale of betrayal and deception where love turned fatal, and a shallow grave revealed the truth that one woman tried to bury. Case number 6 is that of Sheila Denise LeBron, a woman whose name became known across South Carolina for a crime that unfolded not out of hatred, but out of heartbreak and anger. Her story is one of domestic conflict turned deadly, a moment of rage that ended the life of her estranged husband and shattered 2 families forever. In 2020, Sheila LeBron and Jasper Bernard Bryan were in the final stages of separating after years of a troubled marriage. Their relationship had been marked by tension, financial struggles, arguments, and emotional distance that had eroded whatever love once existed between them. When Jasper returned to their home one afternoon to collect his belongings, what should have been a brief civil exchange turned into a fatal confrontation. According to investigators, an argument broke out almost immediately. Neighbors later reported hearing raised voices and the sound of things breaking inside the house. Jasper reportedly told LeBron he was leaving for good, and something about those words pushed her past the breaking point. In a moment of fury, she grabbed a handgun and fired. The bullet struck Jasper, killing him before help could arrive. LeBron stayed on the scene, distraught and crying when officers arrived. She told them she hadn't planned to shoot him, that she just wanted him to stop talking. But her words couldn't undo what had happened. She was arrested and charged with murder, her life spiraling into the same chaos that had consumed her marriage. In court, prosecutors described the shooting as the tragic result of unresolved anger. They argued that LeBron had acted out of vengeance, not fear. Her defense team countered that the situation had been volatile for years, that she had felt cornered, emotionally manipulated, and desperate. They portrayed her not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a woman who snapped after years of emotional strain. Ultimately, the court accepted her plea to voluntary manslaughter in 2023. She was sentenced to several years in prison, a punishment reflecting both accountability and compassion for the emotional turmoil that led to the crime. The case of Sheila LeBron struck a chord across South Carolina, reminding the public that not all murders are premeditated acts of cruelty. Sometimes they are explosions of emotion born from years of resentment and silence. Domestic violence advocates pointed to her story as a painful example of how unresolved conflict can escalate when communication and support break down. Jasper Bryan's family mourned his loss, remembering him as a devoted father and friend. For them, forgiveness came slowly. For LeBron, every day behind bars became a reminder of how one impulsive decision destroyed everything she once loved. Her case is a cautionary tale, not just about crime, but about control, emotion, and the fine line between anger and tragedy. It shows how quickly passion can transform into violence when fear and frustration replace understanding. And as this story of domestic heartbreak closes, the next case moves into darker territory, a tale of betrayal and deception where love turned fatal and a shallow grave revealed the truth that one woman tried to bury. Case number 7 is that of Jessica Marie Strachan, a woman whose desperate attempt to hide a deadly act would unravel into one of South Carolina's most chilling stories of betrayal and deceit. Her crime, born from a turbulent on-again, off-again relationship, revealed just how thin the line can be between love, obsession, and violence. Jessica Strachan and Devonte Alexandra Griffin had been together for several years, a relationship defined by passion and volatility. Friends described them as inseparable when things were good but explosive when they weren't. Arguments often turned into public scenes, and breakups were followed by tearful reconciliations. By 2022, the relationship had become toxic beyond repair, but neither could seem to walk away. In early spring of that year, Griffin disappeared. At first, few suspected foul play. Jessica claimed he had left town after another argument, saying he needed time to think. But as days turned into weeks, his family grew increasingly concerned. Griffin wasn't answering calls, missing work, or contacting his young daughter, things completely out of character. The truth began to emerge only when investigators, following a tip, searched a wooded area outside Florence County. There, buried in a shallow grave, they found his decomposed body. The autopsy revealed he had been killed before burial. Investigators quickly turned their attention to Jessica Strachan, the last person known to have seen him alive. Evidence mounted quickly, phone records, text messages, and physical traces that tied her to the burial site. When questioned, she initially denied involvement, but under pressure, her story shifted. She admitted to being present when Griffin died, but insisted it was an accident during a heated argument. Prosecutors weren't convinced. The evidence suggested deliberate concealment, if not premeditation. They charged her with murder and tampering with evidence, painting a picture of a woman who, in a moment of rage, took her boyfriend's life and then tried to erase every trace of it. Her defense later negotiated an Alford plea, a rare legal arrangement where the defendant maintains innocence but acknowledges that the state has enough evidence to secure a conviction. In 2023, Jessica Marie Strachan was sentenced to 35 years in prison. During sentencing, she appeared emotionless, her voice breaking only once when she mentioned her daughter. The court noted that her attempt to hide the crime had caused additional pain to Griffin's family, forcing them to live for months with uncertainty before learning the truth. The case sent shockwaves through Florence and surrounding communities. It was a story that resonated far beyond its violence, a modern tragedy of love consumed by anger. Commentators described it as a cautionary tale about how toxic relationships, when left unchecked, can spiral into catastrophe. Devonte Griffin's family spoke publicly after the sentencing, remembering him as a devoted father and gentle soul who deserved far better. His mother said, "We can forgive, but we can't forget." She buried him once, but she buried us all with him. Those words echoed the heartbreak of a family forced to live with the unimaginable, that the woman their son once loved had taken his life and left him in the ground like a secret. Jessica Strachan's case stands as one of the most haunting examples of how passion, when mixed with violence, can destroy everything in its path. It reminds us that even love, when poisoned by control and resentment, can become deadly. And as we leave this story of deceit and buried truth, the next case takes us from private betrayal to public outrage, a confrontation between two strangers that turned deadly in broad daylight, all over something as trivial as the right-of-way in a parking lot. Case number 8 transports us from private betrayal to shocking public violence in a grocery store parking lot, a place of mundane errands that became the stage for a fatal confrontation. This is the story of Christina Harrison, a woman whose temper turned a trivial inconvenience into irreversible tragedy, claiming the life of Alexandria Alex Cresbys. It was Valentine's Day, 2023. The Kroger parking lot was hectic with last-minute shoppers. Among them were Christina Harrison and Alexandria Cresbys, two strangers whose paths would cross for less than a minute. As Cresbys navigated the crowded lanes, their vehicles disputed the right-of-way. What should have been a minor frustration, a honked horn, escalated with terrifying speed. Witnesses described both women stopping their cars and getting out. A loud, heated argument erupted over the absurd pettiness of who had the right to drive forward first. For most, this would be a forgotten story of road rage. But for Harrison, the anger was combustible. As the verbal clash peaked, she retrieved a handgun from her vehicle. In front of horrified onlookers, Harrison raised the firearm and shot Alexandria Cresbys at close range. Cresbys, a 26-year-old with her whole life ahead of her, fell to the pavement. She was pronounced dead at the scene, surrounded not by loved ones on a day of romance, but by the stark reality of sudden violence. Harrison fled, but was apprehended a short time later, the Valentine's Day gifts still in her car. The evidence was overwhelming: clear eyewitness accounts, surveillance footage, and the recovered weapon. There was no hidden motive, no long simmering plot, only a blinding, fatal flash of rage. Harrison was charged with murder and possession of a firearm during the commission of a violent crime. In the ensuing legal process, the defense argued for manslaughter, suggesting the act was not premeditated but born from the heat of the moment. The prosecution, however, held firm. They argued that introducing a gun into a petty argument was an act of such extreme recklessness that it demonstrated a depraved heart equivalent to murder. Facing a likely conviction, Harrison accepted a plea agreement. In late 2023, Christina Harrison was sentenced to 25 years in prison. During her statement, she offered a tearful apology to the Cresbys family, stating she never intended for this outcome. The presiding judge emphasized the profound responsibility of gun ownership, stating, "A parking space is not worth a life. A moment of pride is not worth a lifetime of regret." The case ignited a fierce local debate about road rage, easy access to firearms, and the death of civility. Alexandria Cresbys was remembered by her family as a vibrant, kind-hearted young woman with a promising career in nursing whose life was cut short senselessly. Her mother said, "My daughter's life was stolen over nothing, absolutely nothing. We are left with a void that can never be filled, all because someone couldn't take a deep breath and just back up." The story of Christina Harrison is a grim, modern parable. It reminds us that in an age of quick tempers and readily available weapons, a single impulsive decision can shatter multiple lives forever, proving that the most dangerous threats are not always hidden in shadows. Sometimes they are right next to us in the checkout line. And as we move from this story of public fury, our next case descends into a much darker world of exploitation. The investigation that would expose a sophisticated human trafficking ring operating behind the facade of seemingly legitimate massage parlors. Case number 9 descends into the most profound and unsettling of human tragedies, a mother's betrayal of her most sacred duty. This is the story of Shaquan Dooley, a woman whose internal turmoil culminated in an unthinkable act, claiming the lives of her 2 innocent sons, Devine and Javan. In 2010, Shaquan Dooley was a young mother in her 20s, known to friends and family as quiet and devoted to her boys. Behind closed doors, however, she was buckling under the immense weight of parenthood, financial strain, and a deepening despair that no one fully saw. The precise trigger remains known only to her, but on one fateful day, the dam broke. In a methodical and chilling sequence, Dooley smothered her 2 young sons, ending their lives inside her home. The horror of this act was only compounded by what followed. With her sons' bodies in the vehicle, she drove to the North Edisto River. There, in a deliberate and calculated move, she rolled her car into the water, attempting to stage a tragic accident. The vehicle was discovered submerged, and the initial assumption was a terrible mishap. But the evidence quickly unraveled her story. An autopsy revealed the truth the water was meant to hide. Devine and Javan showed no signs of drowning. They had been dead before the car ever entered the river. The investigation swiftly turned from accident to a double homicide, with Dooley as the sole suspect. She was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. The case sent shockwaves through the community, leaving a lasting scar of grief and incomprehension. How could a mother destroy her own children? For 2 years, the legal process unfolded as Dooley maintained her facade. Finally, in 2012, facing irrefutable forensic evidence, she abandoned her claim of an accident. She stood before the court and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. There was no trial, no dramatic testimony. Her plea was a stark, quiet admission of the truth she had tried to bury in the river. The court sentenced her to 2 concurrent life terms, ensuring she would spend the remainder of her days in prison, forever confined by the memory of her actions. The sentencing brought a painful, formal closure, but no answers that could satisfy the anguish. Family members described Devine and Javan as bright, joyful boys whose lives were extinguished by the person they trusted most. A relative stated, "We lost 3 souls that day. 2 are with God, and 1 is in a prison of her own making." Shaquan Dooley's case stands as a harrowing testament to the silent crisis of mental health and the catastrophic consequences when a parent sees no way out. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the source of unthinkable danger can sometimes be found not in the shadow of a stranger, but in the embrace of a mother. And as we turn from this intimate, devastating horror, our next case returns to the public sphere, a story of reckless disregard on the open road, where a fleeting moment of impatience led to 2 needless deaths and a frantic flight from responsibility.